Welcome, adventurers, to the Recall to Adventure podcast, where we're celebrating 25 years of Islands of Adventure. We'll be sitting down with some of the original show producers, animators, engineers, and designers for Universal Orlando Resort's Second Gate. We're your hosts, Maya
and Holly.
And now, for this episode, we're joined by Robert Waddell, who was the visual effects producer for Poseidon's Fury. Thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thank you for having me. Actually, it's kind of a small honor. I hadn't thought about that project in many years, but I think it's really great. It's just kind of fun to sort of remember something that happened a long time ago, a couple decades of doing that kind of work. So, yeah, I thank you for asking me to come aboard and give you a few of my insights and what I did back then.
Thank you so much.
To start off, how did you get started in the theme park industry?
Well, I had no clue really about the theme park world per se. It wasn't something that I one day woke up and decided this is what I want to do. I had already been working in the film industry for, I think, probably 10 years, close to that, I think, maybe 5 to 7 years, let's say. I had worked for a company. I got hired at a company that no longer is in business called Metrolight Studios in Los Angeles. And they were basically, we'll do anything, work for hire. We did a lot of movie trailers, television commercials. I was also one of the producers. I was one of four or five, depending on how busy we were. But I was hired on to bid on feature film visual effects. So I would usually get 1 to 2, maybe as many as 5 a week scripts to bid on. So I just would go through the scripts, come up with evaluation in terms of time and estimates. And that's really how it started. But before that, I still had a film background. And so that was something that was the reason why I was hired there, because I had that background. And back then, most of the time, a lot of the projects, a film production company would go out and shoot plates, backgrounds, or with actors in it. And then we, would have to bid on how do we add an effect into that, or it would turn out that this portion of the location was ideal for the actors to be in, but the other half was downtown LA. We had to get rid of it and that kind of thing. So it was very traditional. But before that, I was hired at a company called DreamQuest Incorporated, and that was in 1981. And it was a motion control photography. So this was where they would build a camera and put it on basically a track that had yaw, pitch, and roll. And we hooked it up to sensors that would record that data. And so first thing I ever did were opening title credits for Francis Ford Coppola's movie, One from the Heart. Still to this day, it's still a great thing to look at for its time. There were no digital effects. It was all built with marquees of Las Vegas. Nastasha Kinski starred in it, and Frederick Forrest starred in it. I mean, it was a very, very wacky world of love and romance. We flew around the traditional marquees of Las Vegas at the time, the Sands Hotel, Caesar's Palace, and there were miniatures that were built, and we would take the cameras and fly around them and turn the lights on and off and have the titles of the credits for the people who were producing the show, things like that. So that's how I got my start, and that's how it evolved when I eventually went over to Metrolight Studios.
That's pretty cool. So I guess once you were there, how did that eventually lead into Islands of Adventure?
It was basically, Robert, are you free? We have the script that came in. Here's story for a theme park attraction for Universal Studios. And I had free time. All the other producers were busy doing something. But I think also because I think they knew that I probably had the right chops to sort of read through it and understand what was going on. So there was an initial written treatment, of the idea of what the story was supposed to be about in the sets and what they wanted to do, rear projection onto sheets of water, which I thought, oh my God, how are we going to figure this out? To be honest with you, I think that even at the time for Universal, they obviously knew through engineering and design that yes, this could theoretically be done, but I don't think no one had done anything like that. And obviously that's where you're pushing the envelope in terms of themed entertainment to come up with something completely different than the last project. And I thought, boy, I either got very lucky, got assigned this, but it was something I really wanted to try to achieve. The final output was on film, 70 millimeter and 35 millimeter film. And that was the challenge. So I was involved from the get-go, from whatever the creative design package that the Metrolite Studios received. So I was given the task to just go through it all, go through all the material, and come up with what we thought it was going to take to animate the characters. We didn't really have a specific character, wasn't locked in yet. So that was all part of the design phase, which is normal for any project. And then trying to figure out what's the best way to approach this in terms of how do we do this? Because back then we didn't have VR headsets. That wasn't even around. So basically we did an old tried and true method of storyboarding and come up with some basic timings onto VHS tape or beta, which we all call back then animatics. And we came up with little screens. Back then the resolution was so small that you had these little windows with these little characters jumping around in storyboard form, trying to come up with a timing and a character and what the narrative is and put all those elements together and just build out the pre-concept of what this is, and closely working with Universal Studios for the approval of how this was all going to play out.
Kind of going off of that, how exactly did that story evolve over time? Because it sounds like they came to you with like an initial pitch or initial idea, but how did it change?
Honestly, I can't remember. All I know is that the idea was Poseidon, this underwater creature in an underwater grotto that was going to speak to us and animate and tell the story of this duel between Zeus and Poseidon. I just don't remember how much of that was pre-designed. Basically, that was just part of what with the process of doing the creative design phase with, working with Dale Mason and Mario Camberg to come up with whatever that concept was. So that's pretty much how it started. And it's an iterative process. Obviously, the way it went was the character that you may recall, which ultimately ended up being the original version, which was this animated sea creature, kind of, mischievous, devilish underwater character that evolved over time. So in traditional storyboarding, character design development, we started off with line drawings, character development of the head of Zeus. What was everybody looking for? Where are we trying to take this? Which is the normal process of designing any character. It's an iterative process. And Mario was, say the least, he's got a very creative mind. I think obviously Dale had an idea where he wanted to take it, and Mario is the type of person that could push it into existence. That's how it really evolved.
Going off of that, we ended up with a pretty traditional or expected design for Zeus, but then Poseidon's design is drastically different. He's a merman. What inspired that contrast between the two?
You know what? I can't always get in the mind of the creative. Oftentimes, I just think that it was just something where people just the creatives wanted to push the design envelope and see how far you could take it. I really think that's what happened at the time, because even though I understand the creative process, that's not my position. Oftentimes, my job is to make sure whatever you guys agree upon, we can produce it. I mean, I might have had some of my own opinions about it, but at the end of the day, it was really Dale Mason and Mario Camberg and the powers that be, that Dale worked with at Universal, that decided at that time that this was the character they wanted, and it was, it's kind of a shock value, definitely something that I had never seen before. And I think a lot of people probably agreed with that. But so I think that's ultimately what everybody decided. Let's make this guy as this creature, this thing that happened called a mer person, underwater mermaid, underwater mer creature, these kind of things. That kind of potentially had sort of been the baseline for a lot of other shows that came out with other companies and other theme parks that wanted to sort of mimic that style a little bit. Not necessarily the actual character, but the environments and that whole just sort of, it just opened a new door for people to think, oh, why not? I think that was something that just sort of evolved and people liked it. And so, I went along with it. I thought, why not? It was just something that was different. And I had never developed a character like that before, and allowed the creative process to push the envelope wide open until someone says that's far enough. But they took it pretty far. And I, it was a very cool, interesting creature for its time.
I mean, I agree. I think Poseidon's Fury, one of the things that I like about it so much as an attraction is just that it's so different from everything else in the park, and I love it for that. Talking about trying to build these worlds and trying to like push that envelope, like we don't just have these characters, we don't just have Zeus, we don't just have Poseidon, we also have to have this entire world created as well. Like we have these undersea buildings, we have sea creatures that are also involved. What was the process like of coming up with that? And what were the challenges there?
Well, like any good storytelling from a visual point of view, the story that's never really told is something that happens sort of subconsciously in your mind that, when you're building an environment like that. It's all those little detail that you're not really looking at specifically. Our eyes are meant to go look at Poseidon and maybe a big whale that swims by, but it's all that little stuff, those small detail that can bring something alive. And that's always the goal. But the huge challenge with something like that was we're not projecting media onto a traditional silver screen where you have that reflective quality, that 18% gray, so to speak, with that reflective quality that's in the silver screens that do that in a normal projected theater. And rear projection also has its unique set of challenges, and we're projecting onto sheets of water. So water it's reflective, but when you're shooting light through it from behind, basically dulls down your image. It flattens colors, the contrast goes away, and just everything you would think, from a traditional filmmaking, that there's certain exposure values that work, that there's a certain color palette, spectrum of colors across the rainbow that, will work. But in these environments, because of that, and this is also the nature of just when you get off a traditional film screen, the colors, everything distant from the screen, the angle of the projector to the screen, all of that goes out the door. And then you have to figure out, how can I make it look like a beautiful movie environment? And so the color palette had to be really evaluated in terms of how do we punch up all this color, the phosphorescent color palette, the greens, the pinks, and the blues and things like that. All these neon bright colors lend itself very well. At least that's what we all kind of knew. We all suspected that the only way we're going to pull this off is to create this color palette that just went off the charts. In other words, if you were to take the film and look at it on a light box, you go, what are we looking at? So by the time it gets projected out, the distance it's being thrown onto the screens, then we had to go through this entire process of what we call back then, it's still used today, especially from my generation, is wedge testing. It's very old-fashioned, tried and true method of saying, here's one frame of normal from the computer screen, and then we output it film recorder to film. There's a shift, obviously, with whatever the emulsion came from Kodak, and it says, okay, this is our normal. We have normal lights on the film, and then we have a normal that we baseline that we say, this is what we're just going to start with. And then from that, when we call a wedge, we'll go 6 stops brighter, meaning half a stop, 1 full stop, or EV values, they call them today, of just various different incremental brightness levels till it's blown out. And then conversely, we do it underexposing the same way. And then on top of that, we were going to add a color variant. We're going to take blue from that normal test strip and then go the same thing, just keep adding blue, which we think should be our normal, and then overexposing it, making it lighter on one side and then going the opposite on the other. And then take that output that film and then put it into the projector on location down in Universal and run a loop. So we'd have these 30-foot rolls of film that we would just thread up in the projector without going through the film mags, where you put all the film where it unloads and then loads back into another magazine. And we would literally just run the film through the gate, literally drag on the floor and just go back up into the system and then loop it around over and over and over and over and over again until we could watch it and decide, okay, so we know what our normal is. And then now we see, well, we like the underexposed one by 30% of that blue, but we like the underexposed green by 60%, or whatever the case is. So we came up with guesses. And from that, we would take that information, bring that back into the studio, and then try to come back with another baseline normal from that new test and plug that into our scripts for the digital media and go through that whole process all over again. So that was just the first part, trying to balance the color to make sure everyone was really happy with it. So it was a huge process because oftentimes we're outputting maybe 30 feet of film and half of that was nothing but handle, which the projectionist would use just to thread up the projector. And then I would take a red-eye flight down to Orlando, and then in the morning, go right over to the set, thread up the projectors, work with the projectionist, and then we go look at the tests, and then I jump on a plane and come back to LA and take all that information we gleaned and then do the next process. It was a lot of traveling involved just to get all that done, and it's a long process. It was a very long process back then. But that was only part of it. The other part was, we have to output onto film. So that process was the 70 millimeter film, and I believe we were using 8 perf film, meaning IMAX, that's with 15 perforations across. So it's a pretty good size frame. So we were probably about a third of that size. But 70 millimeter film and 35 millimeter film have different characteristics in terms of the emulsion. So, we had to balance those accordingly to try to get those to look as almost identical as we possibly could. Because when Zeus jumped from one screen to the next, he was either from a 70 millimeter projected element to a 35 millimeter element. So we had to make sure that we tested that correctly. And then finally, what the other problem was is that we have rear projection at a very obtuse angle to the screens. And again, traditional filmmaking or in a theater, it's pretty much straight on or slightly down at an angle to the screen. But in this case, the projectors were at a very, very exaggerated angle because they had to fit through the facility, get up, and shoot through onto these sheets of water that were way high up in the air. And so when you project a square image outward that's at a off angle, that image now starts to distort, which is called keystoning, meaning that when you take a normal square image and you just tilt it, you start to realize that the top left and right corner become elongated and the bottom left and right gets narrower. And so from the digital out, we had to figure out what that keystoning angle was. And then we had to pre-render that digitally and then put that image at a very wonky image and then output that onto film and then go test that to make sure that it would fit correctly, that it wouldn't shoot off up into the ceilings or down to the side or someplace we didn't want the film to be. So there were some pretty interesting challenges. It was fun trying to figure that out. I have to admit, I had a lot of fun trying to figure that out.
How many times, how much of trial and error that had to have taken is just mind-blowing because it's all physical film. Like that takes time and money to produce. So any errors there, that's just wow.
It's hard to say. We went through several thousand feet of film just in testing, but it was really expensive. That's the way it was done back then. But yeah, it was a lot of work.
I guess, kind of out of curiosity, one of the things you talked about was Zeus jumping from screen to screen. I imagine that getting the timing between all the projected screens must have taken a while to get right as well.
Well, again, going back to what I originally mentioned, when you're in the creative design phase, when we created our animatic, with our storyboard characters. And we would, start with our two main 70 millimeter screens, which were I believe the ones that were in the back, and then the forward screens were 35 millimeter. We had to figure out what that timing was, because there is a delay by the time, Zeus would leap off a screen and go to the next screen over. We had to figure out how many seconds or literally frames it was that he would be off screen and back on screen. That took some time. And again, that also was compounded with the fact that now that we have this, which I refer to as this keystoning problem, where you have the projector at an extreme angle to the flat screen that the guest sees. We have this back screen, which is the 70 millimeter, and the projector's back here. It's shooting across, but now it's going to hit another screen that's at an even more extreme angle than the first one. At what point do we transition? We go from the characters off screen for that moment and jumps to another screen at another completely different keystone requirement. In other words, this may have been at a 30-degree keystone that the digital camera view was chipped at 30 degrees, but then up here it's 45 degrees. And I don't remember the exact amount it was, but the farther you go, the more the extreme angle you get. And you also have the inverse square law effect of light, that falls off proportionately to the square of the distance. The light that was balanced, from wedge testing on the back screen, you dial that in, and now you're throwing in another 20 or 30 more feet. Everything becomes darker, or the colors get softer, whatever the case is. Now that I think about it, yeah, there were some stressful moments trying to figure out, how we're going to make this work. That's what I really loved about it. And all the other shows I've done after that was, how do we make this work? That's why, it just fascinated me. And I was just really lucky that I got the opportunity to work on it.
It's just kind of mind-blowing, like all these like little tricks that like have to be done in order to be able to get it to work and come together. Kind of mind-blowing, really. I'd love to see what like that original film looked like, to just see how drastic the color differences were and how distorted the image looked like, just on the film itself.
It wouldn't even be anything that you would thought would look normal.
So we've talked a lot about projectors, and this was the first time water screens were used in a theme park. But what was it like trying to blend those animated elements with the physical sets?
It wasn't really a huge factor, to be honest with you, because the guest experience is inside an underwater stone grotto. So, it was muted browns and, colors like that. And the set designers, they had a color palette, with bright colors that would glow in the dark to make it kind of mysterious and interesting looking, coral, things like that. So we definitely took that into mind. But I think what's really important to understand here is when you have media playing, you want the guest to focus solely on what they're supposed to be seeing on those screens. So I think, we knew generally that there was a color palette to work with, but we wanted to really punch it up and really make this the portal that you're looking out at for guests to really keep their attention focused where we wanted it to. We don't want them looking around, which is the way it should be. The field of view, for the guest experience is supposed to be where you want them to look. So that's the key moment there. So the bright color palette of the blues and the greens and the pinks and all the colors that we use, it's very dynamic. And so, it draws you to looking where you're supposed to be looking. So it really wasn't an issue that I felt, for at least for that show, looking back on it, that wasn't our biggest concern. Based on what I just explained.
Yeah, based on what we've heard, we had some bigger issues at play.
So, but, we had, again, creative directors were there. That's their job, to wrangle all that and make sure that, they can get their vision out. This is what I see. This is what I want. And I'm more than happy to give them what they want if we can achieve it. And obviously, I think for that project, during those days, I think we did. It wasn't really the biggest issue in terms of what I was responsible for, because we made it work, bottom line.
I do think that talking about how the grotto has more of like muted browns and like a kind of different color scheme compared to like the bright animation, I think that also kind of makes sense from a storytelling perspective, because there's this idea that like the water screens are like holding back the water from the grotto and you're looking out.
Yeah, force field water. Yeah, that Poseidon's powers, had the ability to do that. And yeah.
So we've talked a little bit about the physical sets, but there's also like actual like actors that are involved in this as well. Like we had the keeper character, and the big reveal at that is he becomes Zeus. So what was that like?
Well, again, we had a script, for the entire length. We had a working script. It was part of our animatic. That would be basically our timing sheet to start from. So that wasn't anything that I thought was a problem for us, or at least for myself, concerned with the media. We knew what the timings were, and I think that was obviously part of the show producers that worked on the show knew that they had that physical element of a live actors up on that. I think it was this pedestal they made where the character would come out and speak. It's like anything, you have this idea, you try it, you make it work, and you refine it. And that wasn't anything that I wasn't involved in working with the performers of any kind. So all we really had from the performance was the recorded dialogue, which we used as timings. So not very much involved with that. But, obviously we had to decide where the actor was. If there was some key moment in the media, we didn't want playing behind, the actor wasn't stepping on anything of importance in the media. So obviously some of those considerations were made, but it's really not an issue. It's a very common thing to do, and it works. And, you have ways to creatively work around a lot of those challenges, if you want to call it that, just to be able to create the ultimate guest experience.
Yeah, it is kind of neat how all of it comes together. Like we've got physical sets, physical effects, animation, live actors, a lot went into this.
Speaking of everything that went into the attraction, while you didn't work on it, we are curious. What are your opinions and reactions to the water tunnel?
Well, it was pretty impressive, I have to admit. I mean, they used a jet turbine to move that amount of water. It was loud. I have to admit, the decibels around there were quite loud. But to push that water, I mean, that takes the engineering to design that and the mechanics behind it to make it work and repeat itself flawlessly for a certain amount of time. Obviously, I'm sure they had challenges with that thing working sometimes, like any mechanical aspect of a show that's, behind the scenes. But it was quite impressive. I have to admit, when the water's rushing around you like that, it was very impressive. And I think for its time, everyone was like in awe of it. How did they figure this one out? Again, somebody has a great idea, and then you put all the right heads together and you figure out, can we do this? And they figured it out, and I thought it was very well done.
It's amazing. I like looking at it. I think it's very awesome.
Yeah, it's very cool to look at. It's one of those things where, because now sadly Poseidon's Fury is closed, but I've like shown videos of it to people, and they're like, "Oh, that's cool. Is that like some sort of like screen?"
Nope.
Actually, a real thing. Actually, water. It's very cool. Like I think that effect holds up like so well, even now. It's very cool. So that said, the original version of Poseidon's Fury did not end up lasting very long. It lasted like I think 2 years, 3 years about. So I guess, have you been able to see both versions? And I guess what are your thoughts on it as someone who designed it?
Well, to be very honest with you, I was disappointed. You're part of a team that was designing something that no one has done before. And yeah, there was definitely disappointment in that. I think also too, that I think if you're looking at the level and the quality of animation for that time period, back in the mid 90s, it certainly was not sophisticated as it is today. And, with the use of mocap, and you look at Avatar, I mean, there wasn't even that ability to do that level of quality back then, obviously. But also, too, I think there was sort of a struggle between people that felt that, the live action was still the best way because you get fluid motion, you get lip sync, everything works better. So you add that character and shoot it on a blue screen and then comp it in the background and everything's done. And I think obviously that was something that we could have done. And actually, I did do that. I actually worked prior to Poseidon's Fury. I did another show, which actually is still running at Caesar's Palace in Vegas, called Atlantis. And they had big fountains and the animatronics and a big dome up top. And we actually shot Poseidon as a live action character. And that was back in the mid 90s as well. So I guess my point I'm trying to come up with is that, I mean, everybody knows that the animation for that day was, you can only get so good with it. So you had to honestly know that that's as good as it can get. But so you had to creatively accept that fact that this is an animated character. Everybody knows it in the back of their mind. And it's not going to be that fluid motion that a real actor would give to the performance. As hard as we tried and, as much as we did. And I think we did an incredibly good job during that time period. But I think, and I don't know what really happened. I wasn't involved. I think maybe that a lot of people thought that it probably would have been better if they had done it as a live action character. And I think they gave the original one a chance. They studied it, they watched it, the reaction of the guests. And I think some people decided that it would be better to go back to a character that people would feel a little more comfortable with. I don't know. I'm guessing. I'm putting some of my own assumptions in it, but I just, like I said, I like the original because I worked on it. That was the challenge. And I think a lot of people were very happy with it, but it's not my call at that point. And that's not unusual. People decide that, let's do something a little bit different, change it out. And that's what happens. But obviously I was very impartial and loyal to the original concept. But all the backgrounds stayed the same. It was just that character. All of that, except for the character, was still intact. Nothing changed in it.
There's something about the attraction just generally, whether it's like the original version or like the newer version, where it's like it gives you that like 90s charm that I really like.
There you go. Like I said, for its day, in the 90s. Yeah, exactly. If I can just kind of cross-reference the other show I did at Caesar's Palace, some of the shows got ripped out because they wanted to put more retail and, to sell. But it became so campy that just became sort of a genre all unto itself. Let's go see this really cheap show, And I kind of appreciate it more in the long run, I suppose. But
Poseidon's Fury is one of those things where it's like whenever I would go to Islands of Adventure at any point with friends, family, or whatever, it'd be like, all right, let's go to Poseidon's Fury. We got to go do it.
One more time.
Mandatory attraction. But I mean, speaking of retail, the Poseidon's Fury gift shop is still open and it still has the original like merman version of Poseidon there. So it still exists in some places. Just have to know where to look.
Become a collector's item.
So you've talked a little bit about some of your other work because like after Poseidon's Fury and after doing all the visual effects, you have done show producing and everything since. So what's some of the advice that you could give to those that want to go into the theme park industry?
I think you just need to be really persistent. You have to really understand what your passion is. You don't grow up being told that, you go into a traditional job of being a lawyer or doctor. I mean, people do it because they're passionate about it. It's very, very hard to get your foot in the door. Very, very hard. I mean, I didn't set out that way. It just kind of was put in my lap. I said, here's a project. You think you might be the best one to help figure this thing out. And I think that's just how you kind of have to play it. Fortunately, right now, I know that Universal, they've hired a lot of people for Epic Park and they've got a lot of projects in the works on other locations. And I think you just have to be passionate about it and figure out how to get your foot in the door, instead of sending the traditional resumes. And I know that's even more difficult today with, the hundreds, if not thousands of people all trying to get the same job. That one opening that happens is to start going to a lot of these events, go to IAPA, start talking to people and just immerse yourself in these places where you can kind of rub elbows with these people and try to talk to some of them. I've had that a lot. I've had a lot of people approach me over the years and ask me how I got into the business. And I kind of basically say the same thing I'm saying now. It's just, you just need to be persistent and you just really have to love it. It's just something that just, you're born with it. It's in your DNA. And just keep working hard at it, but getting involved in these groups, social media is obviously a very good place for it, but to actually be face-to-face, a handshake, eye-to-eye contact, and just physical proximity to other people that work in the theme park business, you can't replace that. I think oftentimes, because of social media, I think we've kind of lost that physical connection of getting involved with that because it's a lot more than just shooting your resume off. People need to know who you are, your personality, kind of work with this person. They might be really talented at something, but they may not jive with other people that they need to work with on a you're working with some of these people night and day, 24/7. In a lot of theme parks, the last big project I worked on out in Malaysia for Genting Highland Resorts, there were up to 50 of us living in a hotel. So we go to work and then we go to dinner. So you're constantly with people as you're creating this family, and family has to get along with each other. But that's the hard part. You just need to get out and just keep being persistent. And someone says no, or they don't, and today they don't respond usually to your inquiry, but it's just being persistent and just keep trying if you want to get out there and do that. It's a niche business, in terms of television and animation, or games and things like that. There's just a bigger audience and more opportunities sometimes. It's easier to get in those doors because of what it is, especially in LA with got game studios everywhere. They're everywhere across the United States, but theme park is very, very dedicated to really one main area right now, down in Florida. And if that's where you want to be and work for these big companies where you can see what's going on, but it's hard, but you just got to be persistent and you got to be really good. You got to stand out somehow. It wasn't like that when I started. There was just always opportunity. Competition has just gotten out there where there's so many people that wanted to be like me. It wasn't always easier for me at times. Even after I've gotten a few jobs under my belt, there's always competition, and there's always going to be someone that's going to try to do that same position that you thought you had it locked. It's getting out and meeting with people and talking with them. But like I said originally, there's nothing like getting out in front of people face to face and physically talking with people so they know who you are. It isn't always about your talent. It's also about your talent and who you are as an individual. And that's really, really critical in my opinion.
Yeah, making connections with people in the industry is super important.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I guess another question I have that's Poseidon's Fury related is, what was your favorite thing about working on the project, just generally?
I think it goes back to the challenge of the unknown. When a person's trying to get into this business or try to do something that's different that nobody else has done, it's very intimidating. But what changes is when you're immersed in it, that's all you live and breathe and sleep and think and everything in your mind. There's a whole other aspect of your character that kind of just a switch just went on, and you go, I'm in it. I've got to figure this out. And come hell or high water, I'm not going to fail. And that becomes the driving force, which becomes very instinctual for me. And I think for just about anybody, when you're involved in something you've never done before and you need to go out and try to figure this out, I think that's incredible high. There's nothing like it when you have a chance to do something that nobody else has done and you get involved in it. So the challenge that I really wanted to figure out was how to technically pull that whole project off. The technical part is, like I said, something that just sort of innately I'm really good at because I understood it. I went to school for it. It's just something that's synced in me really, really well, which I really love. So it's really that challenge. And once you get past that it's a challenge, you evolve into this, I am going to figure this out. You get up every day and you just want to go figure it out. That's what I really liked about that project. It was the first project that had so many challenges on it, but it was achievable. And, you have a group of people that are all like-minded trying to do the same thing. That's what I really loved about it. That's the apple I bit. And, I've been trying to bite that apple ever since.
Last question for you. If you could say one thing to theme park enthusiasts who love your work, what would it be?
Yeah, the big message. I feel like I've got a big weight on my shoulders all of a sudden. Anybody who wants to be in theme park, at some point, there's a side of you that can't grow up. That's that finding that child inside of you that wants to play with this fun zone. I think it's just anyone who goes to theme parks and is not in the business is there because there's this inner child in everybody that wants to have that spirit, because it is fun. It is something that it's that whimsical side of people that can still hold on to that. Don't let go of that, because I think that is what stops us as soon as we get older and we start thinking too hard, then we start putting limits on ourselves. I have an old saying years ago when I was doing a lot of photography, people would ask me about that. What was your inspiration? What were you seeing when you about ready to click the shutter, make that really perfect picture? And I said, well, that's because I stopped thinking. I had that moment of you just connected with something. And I think that's where we have to stop trying to overanalyze it. And it's going back to the original version of Poseidon versus the new version. For someone like me personally, I'm not going to sit there and experience something because it didn't quite fit the bill as a real character. I'm trying to imagine what it would be like, try to be in that moment and just go with it, go along with it, and not try to fight it. Once we stop fighting, then we start, really understanding and living that there's just a fun place to be for just 4 or 5 minutes. Just let the experience happen.
I mean, I think that's a great message for life as well.
Yeah, a good life experience. I'm not sure if I really answered the question or not, but that's the best.
No, that's great. That is a perfect answer, I think.
Yes, I would agree. Thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate you taking time out of your day to come talk to us about Poseidon.
This was great. It was fun. It's reminiscing about something that I had a really good memory for working on that project.
And that brings us to the end of this episode. For our next adventure, we'll be joined by Bob Shreve. See you there!